Welcome, Ziggy. Thank you for joining us today. We're discussing some of the interesting energy speeches that have been presented to CEDA events over the last 10 years, given the importance that energy policy now has in the Australian economy and broader society. In 2009, you gave a fantastic speech to CEDA where you outlined what I thought was a really compelling argument for nuclear power in Australia becoming an increasing source of our energy and electricity supply. How do you think the policy landscape has changed since that time?
I think over the last 10 years or so, the defining event in the industry has been the accident at Fukushima. I mean, the accident and the aftermath delivered a near fatal blow to the industry globally and certainly set back confidence in nuclear power in many areas, including in Australia. So we were seeing a steady improvement in community support for nuclear power that fell away, and it probably hasn't recovered since.
Do you think it's possible for that sentiment to shift? I mean, there were certainly specific circumstances around the Fukushima event. Japan was probably one of the most challenged countries in terms of its geology and geography. Is that something that people will take into consideration and reflect on in the context of Australia's circumstances?
I think they will, because the case for nuclear power in Australia remains compelling. We have lots of uranium, we have a geologically stable continent, we have technically sophisticated people, very good regulators. But in the intervening 10 years, the alternatives to nuclear power and also the demand for electricity has shifted. What we're seeing is the progress in solar in particular, wind to some extent, supported by batteries to address the intermittency. So I think we're in that stage of accepting that the era for big nuclear, big plants, delivering baseload power into a centrally managed grid, that era is over and moving into an area of increasing renewables, decentralisation of generation. The revival of interest in nuclear will happen in the 2020s when the technology for smaller reactors, these small modular reactors, SMRs, is accredited and becomes available and more reliable, etc.
It's interesting because if you go back to your 2009 speech, you actually started talking about the demonisation of coal and the complete rejection of nuclear, putting Australia on a path that would see a reliance on technologies that could compromise the reliability, the productivity, and in fact the low cost structure of the existing electricity system in Australia. Are you now saying that you feel the advances in some of those technologies will take us into a situation where base load can be dealt with and that nuclear really is for another decade or so?
I think that's the case. I mean, it was clear 10 years ago that although there was sort of technical appeal in renewables, a lot of the debate and some of the policy decisions were ideologically based. They weren't based upon either thoughtful economics, consideration of what the ultimate pricing impact would be, or the stability of the grid. Now in 2018 what we're finding is the issues of intermittency and backup are front and centre, and the promoters of renewable energy have to accept that as part of the kind of business case and the cost of deploying renewables. But the renewable technologies, particularly solar, and wind's been there all along, are now quite compelling in their performance and in their economics.
Yeah, so the question I was going to ask next actually is that to what extent other countries are in a similar situation to Australia. I mean, I think clearly others were ahead of us in terms of their preparedness to rely on nuclear before Fukushima, but there are rapidly growing economies that will have challenges in meeting their energy and electricity needs. So your sense is that there will be more of an appetite for nuclear in those countries, and do you see it displacing other energy sources or as a complement to other energy sources?
In the early stages, developing countries are happy to embrace coal. It's widely available, it's economic, the infrastructure is often in place or easily scaled. So I expect that'll take many of these economies forward for the next 10 or 20 years, no matter what people in the kind of first world feel about the use of coal. Once the newer, smaller reactors become available, they'll generate 100 or 200 megawatts of electricity. They'll cost hundreds of millions of dollars rather than billions of dollars. They'll be less kind of threatening in terms of scale safety and security. We will see them initially adopted by the countries that develop the technology, which will be primarily China, India and Russia, and then elsewhere in the world. The other point I wanted to make based on an earlier question of yours is 10 years ago it was clear that Australia had the benefit of a competitive advantage given the way it generated electricity through the burning of coal and gas. We knowingly or unknowingly abandoned that position by going down the path of renewables and generally discouraging continuing investment in coal generation. And so we've moved from a position where input costs from energy, which are important in many industries and were an advantage 10 years ago, are now a disadvantage because our renewable generation is not that efficient. It is not, it does not benchmark well against global alternatives. I think we're in a poorer position now than we were 10 years ago. And we probably cannot recover from that because the natural advantages that we had are no longer advantages, and the availability of wind and the sun is kind of a democratically accessed resource. And the new technologies around nuclear won't come out of this country, they'll come out of other markets or other countries who will have the advantage that comes with being the product developers.
Ziggy, how would you like to see the conversation on nuclear energy progressed in Australia from here?
It would be most helpful if we had a clearly articulated overall national energy strategy that said, this is the progression we want to move along in terms of the mix of technologies, broadly speaking, with the aim of providing cost-effective, resilient electricity that is also environmentally compliant with our greenhouse gas aspiration. Once you do that, and associated with that may be some form of carbon price, then the market will take care of which technologies will best fit that strategy. And I think in that kind of evidence-based, policy-shaped debate, nuclear will emerge as a viable component of the energy mix.
Ziggy, thank you so much for your time. It's been an interesting conversation, and I feel a little bit of a missed opportunity perhaps for Australia, but plenty more opportunities for us to continue conversations on energy in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melinda.